Hey guys, welcome to the last part of Chapter 6. We're on Chapter 6, Lesson 4. And if you would like to take advantage of the study tip yesterday where we talked about reading before you watch the video, it's going to be here on page 168 where it starts with the composition of a community changes over time. And we're going to end on page 172. Up here where it says these checkpoint questions, okay, right next to conservation of island biogeography. Alright, so if you want to take an opportunity to do that, and then I'll be ready for you when you get back. Our study tip for today is know your learning style. What I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a learning style quiz which will give you study tips based on your learning style. So look for that down in the description of the video. And try to implement at least one of the study tips this week. So you'll take the quiz, it'll tell you what kind of learner you are, and then it'll give you some suggestions on how to best study using your learning style. And so it also will give you some tips. So try to implement one of those this week, okay? Alright, so first we're going to talk about ecological succession, which we talked about in class today, which is basically the replacement of one group of species by another group over time. Okay, now time is a very important word on here because as we saw today, it's going to be taking hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years to perform succession to a climax community. Now the time varies from decades to centuries. We have two kinds of succession. We have aquatic and terrestrial. Aquatic meaning in water and terrestrial meaning on land. Now we have two kinds of terrestrial succession. One is primary succession, which starts with bare rock, okay, no soil, and secondary succession, which starts with soil, okay. And we talked about those today during our POGL. So let's break those down a little bit more. Alright, so primary succession starts off in surfaces with no soil, just bare rock. Okay, so I think I'm going to add that here. So I'm going to say bare rock. Okay, so no soil. Now this can be some examples of some places where primary succession might begin are abandoned parking lots or other concrete areas of the city which are abandoned. Exposed rock after a glacier retreat or a glacier melting, and then cooled lava like we talked about today in class. Alright, now the first species to dominate this area or to take over this area is going to be a group called the pioneer species. Okay, now pioneers should remind you of like the olden days when the colonizers came out from Britain to settle America, or you can think about them as the pioneers who first settled the West. Our pioneer species are going to be those like algae, moss, and lichens. Sometimes ferns are included as well. Now, they are special. These pioneer species are special because they excrete an acid, and this acid helps them to erode the rocks under which they live so that it can actually start breaking down that rock and creating gravel and soil, and the more broken up the rock is, the more things it's going to collect. So if we have like a windstorm, it's going to collect more seeds, it's going to collect more dirt if the rocks are broken up. Alright? Now this erosion, like I said, leads to soil, and once the soil has kind of been established, we have this mid-successional plant species that end up colonizing, and those are going to be grasses and wildflowers. Almost all of them are going to be sunlight tolerant, and they have low nutrient requirements. Now, they have to be sunlight tolerant because there's not going to be any shade because there's no trees, and they have to be low nutrient requiring species because there's not enough soil to actually hold on to enough nutrients to support like a really high maintenance plant. Alright, now eventually, after a bunch of years, we have this thing called our climax community. Now, what that climax community looks like is going to be determined by the location or the biome. So the Serengeti, like from the Lion King, is going to look way different than, for example, like a rainforest, okay, a Jungle Book area. Okay, so those are going to be, the climax communities are going to look much different, but that doesn't mean that they're not climax. Okay, it just means that their location or biome is different. Okay, now most climax communities have a lot higher biodiversity than our kind of mid-successional ecosystems, but some actually have lower, so that's kind of strange. All right, next we have secondary succession, which are areas that have been disturbed but have not lost their soil. Okay, so the soil is still intact. Some causes of secondary succession events might be a forest fire or a hurricane. Okay, then the first species that are going to colonize an area for secondary succession is going to be things like grasses and flowers, and their seeds are brought in by the wind or maybe some bird poop. Okay, so we're not going to have our pioneer species like mosses or lichens or anything at first in a secondary succession area because they don't need to create soil. Okay, the soil is already there. Now, the first tree species are going to be ones that grow very rapidly, thanks to our friends the birds who poop out seeds all over the place no matter where they fly. So that's how the seeds get there, and they're going to grow rapidly due to the fact that they're not going to have very much competition. So they're going to have all the photosynthesis that they could possibly want. They're going to have all the nutrients. Okay, so they're going to end up growing very rapidly. Okay, now there's going to be increase in growth rate in the sunlight tolerant trees. Okay, and that's going to lead to more shade. So as the sun tolerant trees grow bigger, there's going to be an increase in shade around the ecosystem. Now some of these ecosystems haven't seen shade in a long time, so that's going to create like this little niche area to where shade tolerant trees can grow. Now some plants, it might not make sense to you, but some plants actually prefer to grow in the shade because they can't stand like the constant beating down of the sun's rays, or maybe they like it to be a little cooler in temperature. And so the fact that now we have some shade, now we can bring in these shade tolerant trees and other plant species and kind of increase our biodiversity. All right. Now eventually shade tolerant trees can grow through the pioneer canopy and outcompete the original pioneer species or the original sunlight tolerant trees, depending upon what happens. Okay, so secondary succession comes on a couple different scales. Small scale, a fallen tree might inspire some secondary succession, especially if it like rips out the roots and then all that's left is the soil. If you've ever been hiking, sometimes that happens where the whole root system of the tree comes out and we're just left with kind of a soil patch. Okay, now secondary succession can happen there. On a more large scale, it can be a natural disaster that causes it and just wipes out the whole ecosystem, so it starts over from soil. Okay, now I wanted us to bring our attention to these pictures here of primary succession. So we're starting with exposed rocks, just bare rocks by itself. Here's our pioneer species, lichens and mosses. We have our annual plants, which means they bloom annually or once every year. Then we have perennial weeds and grasses. They come back multiple times. Shrubs are next, and that's when we start being able to have enough shade and shelter to grow some of these trees. Aspen, cherry, and young pine forest. Okay, so those are going to be our sunlight tolerant trees. And then beech and maple broadleaf forest, that's going to be our climax community. Okay, now if we go over here and we look at our secondary succession, we're going to start with annual plants, which was our third stage in primary succession. Okay, and then we're going to have our perennial weeds, shrubs, aspen, cherry, young pine, beech, and maple. Now, there's a common misconception that primary succession happens first, followed by secondary succession, which is not true. Okay, primary succession is the whole process, start to finish, from bare rock. Secondary succession is the whole process, start to finish, from soil. Okay, primary succession starts with no soil. Secondary succession starts with bare soil. That's the difference. They don't come one after another, or they don't occur one after another. Okay? They are start to finish. It's just a matter of how they start. All right, now let's talk about aquatic succession, which is our next type of succession here. Okay, so we have two kind of opportunities for succession in aquatic ecosystems. So first we have our rocky intertidal zone, which is kind of next to a beach or a cliff. Usually there's a lot of times where oceanic storms will disturb that area, and then the bare rock is colonized by primary succession. Okay, but the species are going to look different than if it were a forest. So we're going to have diatoms in algae. Diatoms are little single-celled organisms in algae, which are photosynthetic, which then leads to the barnacles colonizing and the red algae colonizing. It's really easy to tell because the algae is red. And then our last species are going to be barnacles and mussels, maybe throw in some sea stars. Okay, eventually you have a whole climax community on the shoreline. Okay, then the other example and the picture here is succession in freshwater lakes. What happens is that as plants start to grow around the lakes and erosion kind of happens to erode down the sides and things are dying and things are pooping, okay, they're going to accumulate sediments and fill in the basin and turn the lake into a terrestrial habitat. So if we want to look at this from start to finish.
Attention, Miss Riley, please go to the gym. Miss Riley, please go to the gym.
Okay, so we're starting with the open water lake. Okay, so there's a low freshwater lake, and then after time, increase and floating and submerged plants kind of fill in this area here. We're accumulating sediments, things are pooping and dying and all kinds of things, plants and animals alike. And then at the end, okay, we have the lake basin has been filled up. We are going to have grasses and shrubs and kind of a wet centery bog area. So this can still be considered a wetland, okay, because we're still going to have a lot of sometimes standing water. Okay, but for the most part, it's going to go through secondary succession, terrestrial secondary succession after the lake basin is filled because we're starting with some soil. All right. Then we have some checkpoint questions in our WSQ. Then we have the species richness of a community is influenced by many factors. Okay, 4 factors actually of determining species richness. So the first one's going to be latitude. Species richness increases at the equator and decreases as you go toward the poles. So an increase in latitude leads to a decrease in species richness. I feel like we already know that. It already kind of makes sense. But I want to make sure that our relationships are correct. Okay, make sure that as you're increasing latitude, which means you're going towards the North Pole and the South Pole, you are decreasing species richness. Okay, the next factor is time. The longer time a habitat exists, the higher the colonization, the higher the speciation, but then also the higher the extinction. So it's a lot harder to predict this one, but basically the longer that we leave ecosystems alone, the more time that we have for more species to colonize the area, for species to speciate or create new species, and for extinction events to happen. Okay? And the last 2 are habitat size and distance, and both of those go together to kind of form this theory of island biogeography, which states that there's a dual importance of habitat size and distance in determining species richness. So both of them are equally important. Okay? And so we have our relationships. The increase in size of an area is an increase in species richness due to the increased range of environmental conditions. So you might have a hot area, you might have a cold area, you might have a wet area, you might have a dry area, and so the more niches and environmental conditions you have, the more species diversity you're probably going to have as well. Okay? And so then for distance, the increase in distance leads to a decrease in richness due to immigration. So the farther away 2 communities are, the lower the richness there's going to be due to immigration, and this is especially true with islands. So if you look at islands all around the world, as an island gets increasingly farther away from the mainland, it's going to decrease in species richness because not very many things can travel across oceans. Okay, and I've included in our supplemental videos today a really cool video that some college students made to kind of represent this theory of island biogeography. All right, and that's it for today. I will see you tomorrow.